and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, and we come to you every Sunday and give you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. I'm very, very pleased to have with me on the telephone this evening Dr. David Kirkland. Welcome, David.
Welcome. Thank you, Brenda.
Yeah, thank you so much for agreeing finally to come and talk to us about your work. Just to give the listening audience some background, David E. Kirkland is Associate Professor of English Education and also Director of the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools at New York University. He is a transdisciplinary scholar of English and urban education who explores the intersections among urban youth culture, language and literacy, language, teacher preparation, and digital media. He is active in many organizations. His book that we will be discussing today is A Search Past Silence, and I know that you're also working on another book, and you also are very much tied into the articles and publications on Black males, literacy, urban education. So we'll hear more about that, but it's really, really exciting to have you on. And also you are very much tied in with the National Council of Teachers of English.
Sure. I serve as the co-chair of the Black Caucus for the National Council of Teachers of English, as well as the Conference on College Composition and Communications. In addition to Search Past Silence, as you said, I'm working on a new book, Teaching Hip Hop, which is going to explore, some of the pedagogical philosophies around hip hop, instruction, education, culturally relevant pedagogy, and a pedagogy for justice. I have over 70 articles and publications, as well as 5 books, published. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, so why don't we start with you? You gave us a link into your background and what you've been doing, and all of your interests relate to what we do in urban education, and more specifically, how we work with young Black males. Why don't we start with a discussion of A Search Past Silence in the literacy of young Black men, and what was your motivation behind writing that, and what was that study? Excuse me. What was if you can describe the study and actually what you did?
Okay, I'll describe it. So I'll start with your first question, the motivation behind the book. I've been researching Black men for about 20 years. I started this work, early, in my life. And I noticed early on through my own story, the types of traumas and sensitivities around Black men that don't usually get expressed. I grew up in a brothel. My mother was a prostitute, turned drug addict. In order to do that life, I found that you have to begin to self-medicate in order to endure and cope with, the intense, and debilitating, consequences of patriarchy that, goes along with it. So mom is selling her body, begins to use crack during the 1980s, the crack epidemic. She could no longer take care of us. It was my sister and me, and I had a younger sister. And so in some ways we were all orphaned, but before I became an orphan, I was homeless. And I talk about the time that I lived, in a school in Detroit. I would kick open the door and I would climb into a window, and sleep in the basement inside of the janitor's closet. This was a good-intentioned janitor who would leave his door open so that I could slide into his closet, and sleep, on this old beat-up couch that he had. It was probably one of the best beds I had, up until that point.
What age were you at that point?
I was 12. I was 12 years old, Detroit, Michigan.
Okay.
The school was Barber Middle School, located between Iroquois and Burns on Forest. And this gentleman had almost lost his job, making extreme sacrifices, for this kid. There are other people who made those sacrifices too. I tell that story to really talk about, the sensitivities, the proclivities of, individual experience, the vulnerabilities of young black men that usually don't get talked about. While I lived in that school, I began to pick up books. There was this African-American literature book that the Detroit Public Schools had commissioned, and I remember the first time I picked up a poem. It was Paul Laurence Dunbar's We Wear the Mask. We wear the mask that grins and lies, that hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we paid a human guile with torn and bleeding hearts we smile. And there I was wearing the mask, living in a type of shadow. As I became groomed under the guidance of, scholars such as Geneva Smitherman into this academic life, into this scholarly life,
Well,
I began to read the treatment of African-American men inside of, literacy scholarship, and I was taken back to my own story. Usually this treatment suggested that we were not literate. The treatment, looked at us as problems. Du Bois' question, how does it feel to be a problem? And I haven't felt the inaccuracies. The people who were studying literacy in the lives of black men, to me, they weren't looking in the right places, nor did they understand literacy deeply enough to capture the ways that black men were writing and revealing stories of themselves. There's an African proverb that says, until the lion learns to write history, the story of the jungle will forever glorify its hunter. As a young lion, I decided that I would write the history, the story of literacy in the lives of black men, one that would trace literacy not only from my story, but deeply through the story of 6 young men that I had an opportunity to follow for close to a decade.
Okay, can we put a pin in that for a moment? Because
Sure.
that's a major, put a pin in that. That's a major leap when you look at your background and look at where you are today. Can you talk a little bit more about what that trajectory was, going into high school, going into college, deciding to do a PhD? Just briefly share with us what that journey was like. How did you get to that point? And then
Okay.
go into the discussion of your project.
Okay, I sure can. So in terms of sort of biography, it starts at a brothel turned crack house. Then it moves to the streets of Detroit. Then my grandmother finally takes me in. I'm 13 years old. I'm living on her couch now. So I moved from the janitor's couch in the school that I would break into to my grandmother's house, to her couch, and her doors were wide open. She cooks food every day and gives me a stable, safe place to stay, and I'm happy. I always, in some ways, feel like, a stranger in her home, a freeloader, if you will, and sometimes people in my family, like aunts and uncles, they would remind me that I was freeloading on my grandma. I developed, from those conversations, a desire to pay my grandmother forward because I knew I wouldn't be able to pay her back. She was about 80 years old around the time that she was raising me, and I knew that she didn't have much longer, but I prayed daily that she would at least see me graduate. She saw me graduate high school, but she didn't see me graduate college. College went like this. 17, high school is beginning to end. I don't want to live off my grandmother any longer. I want to be able to support myself and someday support her. So I go to the Marines office, the Marines recruiting office, and I fill out, like this paperwork. They have me take this test. I get 100% on the test, and then they give me these cards with things like integrity, honesty, determination, and discipline on it. And they say, rank these in order of importance. I had no way to rank them, so I created a big circle. And I said, they're all important, and they're important equally. And the lady was an African-American female. She said, I can't let you go to the military. She said, you're too smart. That's what she told me. She said, I can't let you go to the military. You're too smart. She said, go back to your school and ask your counselor for an application to a college. And I said, I can't afford to go to college. I can't even afford a waiver. The lady began to tell me about things like financial aid and, that I didn't have to pay the application fee because I could get a waiver. And so I go to my counselor, and she has one application, Michigan State University. I fill it out. Lo and behold, I get in. I go to school, and I began to struggle because I'm a kid from Detroit, and nobody in my family had ever gone to college.
Right. You
I'm the
weren't even
first.
prepared for how to even apply to college. You didn't even
I
get
didn't
those
even know how
skills.
to, exactly. I had no idea how to apply, how to pay. I mean, check this out. When I first got there, I thought I would get books when I went to my first class, and I didn't know I had to pay for my own books. I didn't even have money to pay for my own books, and I had to, like barter, to get books. I remember, making copies sometimes and, not doing readings. Even now as a professor, I try not to assign books because I was that kid who couldn't always afford them. But I digress. I'm in school. I'm in college. I'm working with this schedule. That's foreign to me. I didn't know that college was, a variety of buildings that occupied this huge space. I thought that you went to one building and that you started at 8 and finished at 3, like high school. That you went Monday through Friday.
Mm-hmm.
It was foreign.
Right.
But lo and behold, I meet another mentor, Geneva Smitherman. She taught me I had language because when I was inside of my college classrooms, I always felt inadequate, like I didn't belong there, like I didn't exist because I spoke this African-American, the strong African-American language from Detroit. And all of my life I had been told, how that wasn't a language, how it was broken, right? That black language is broken white language.
Right.
And Geneva Smitherman began to say, no, that your language is systematic, that it's rule-governed, that it has principles, that it can carry ideas, and it also carries a beautiful experience, both the pain as well as its melody, the rhythm as well as its possibilities. And it was there. It was like, I got a language too? It just changed my life. I decided to major in English at Michigan State.
Yes.
I was an English major. I earned a BA in English. And because I decided to get a teaching certification, and at Michigan State, not only do you do a major, you also do a minor. Well, the difference between an English major and a history minor at the time was about 3 classes. I decided to double major. I double majored English and history and finished Michigan State University at that time with 2 degrees, a BA in English and a BA in history.
Wow.
I go on to earn MS Developmental Psychology and MA Western Philosophy. Years later, I would get a PhD Transdisciplinary Studies with an emphasis on language, literacy, and urban education. And most recently, I earned a JD degree. So from the streets of Detroit, 6 degrees, a PhD, and a JD.
Mm-hmm.
Executive Director of NYU's Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools, as well as the author of the bestseller, A Search Past Silence.
Right. To whom much is given, much is expected. So now we are A Search Past Silence.
Yes.
Tell us what that project, tell us how you constructed that project and what you found.
And so A Search Past Silence, came about, as I said, just through a set of curiosities. When you read the research and the public discourse on literacy in black males, it's a dark, 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 I'm reading. The reading usually goes like this. Black men are dumb. Black men can't read. Black men can't write. Black men who are dumb, who can't read and write, are at risk for going to prison. The prison is filled with young black men who don't read or who don't write. It's a very problematic, dark, picture. The other conversations in response to that is that we have to do what we can to discipline the black male body so that that body contorts in ways, that makes it mimic whiteness. And we understand black male resistance to that type of establishment treatment. Frantz Fanon talks about it in Black Skin, White Knives. Judo Diaz talks about it, in The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Other people have talked about, a type of visceral resistance to, conformity, especially when that conformity is a type of colonial or neo-colonial conformity. Some black men don't want to read like white girls white boys, and no, they don't want to enjoy only those texts. And because those texts are the ones that are featured in schools, we usually lose them.
Yes.
And so what I found doing my own research is how can we begin to ask different types of questions instead of asking, why are these young men not literate? I began to ask, in what ways are they literate?
In what ways?
What are the whys and hows of their literacy? What are their deeper motivations? And what I found is that they're literate in ways that we often ignore or vilify. Like they write raps, like preachers pen sermons. They're into hip-hop. But it's not only hip-hop and the culture of hip-hop, the writing on walls and the writing on bodies to express feeling. They write words, too, and they read books. They just don't read the ones that, people who get to make decisions care about. And as a result, because we don't care about their literacies, and it's a type of, representation of ways that we don't care about them, because we don't care about their literacies and we don't care about them, what happens is this gap is created. This debt is created between the way we do them in schools or understand them in schools and the way that experience is played out. Because we don't have, literacy practices and processes in schools that are culturally affirming to and suggestive of the literate lives of black men, schools become dangerous places for them.
Okay.
Places where they go, instead of succeeding, they go to fail.
Right. Now, just going back into the study, there were some highlights you found out, really some poignant moments in interviewing these men, in meeting with them, and sharing their space. What was, can you specify exactly what you did, and what were some really captivating highlights and moments in your study?
I certainly can. So what did I do? What I did was, the research methods that I used for that work, A Search Past Silence, were anthropological research methods. I was a critical ethnographer, someone who would observe a community, a context, a culture of black men around a particular phenomenon, and that's literacy. The ways that they use text or systems of symbol to construct and to decode meaning as a way of doing everyday life. I stayed with them, the first pass in the field was about 3 years. I had an opportunity, after 2 years to take 2 more years back into the field. There were other moments of conversation, with the young men. So I had a good chance to see them in action, to observe them across a variety of contexts. I interviewed individuals in their lives, had thoughtful conversations with people in their lives, people like grandmothers and aunts, and other people who helped broker literacy, for them. I visited, workplaces and schools, as well as other play spaces, places where they would play video games, places where they would, debate facts. We sat and we had conversations. I would treat them to dinner often, and I stayed with them. I stayed with them for a very long time, for some years, 2 to 3 hours a day, 4 days a week, for a matter of 5 years. And so the data was deep, the engagement was rich in terms of findings. The story of literacy in black men's lives is one of intense curiosity. They're working at who they are. And so questions of identity, stand still as a finding inside of their literacy stories. They're trying to understand what it means to be male and black, how to begin to negotiate the politics of identity and masculinity around, the engagement or interaction with text. What does it mean to be black in that same  And so things like, writing about what it means to be a man, or writing user tropes of black masculinity that are very questionable, become salient inside of some of the conversations. Writing about, one's racial self as one begins to negotiate what it means to be black inside of a space that doesn't always value blackness becomes a salient finding. There are also other findings around, reclaiming lost heritages, trying to understand lineage, like in the absence of mother and father, we see in their writing questions that beg, who am I and who are we? There's also findings around language.
Right.
Young men using, intense creative language in order to understand the world that they live in. They remix or they do what Geneva Smitherman has called semantically invert terminology.
Yes.
Their African American language, exists within the tradition, but it also pushes the tradition.
Right. So
They have dialects that exist on skin and in other places. There's narrative interspersion. There is the type of, some technical elements as well as the discursive modes that exist heavily inside of African American language and that get replicated and amplified inside of hip hop language.
Right. I was you made that leap for me. So how does hip hop, or how has hip hop informed the language? That's one question. And then how is the language, or how has it been perceived as both limiting and liberating?
Well, I think the outside world, perceives it as limiting. Hip hop language as limiting, while it embraces it. You can read a New York Times article and see, a tagline like it's hard out here for a pimp, and other forms of, black language and hip hop language in common use within Americana, because what black language and hip hop language does is it expresses a reality that's raw, clear, and plain, in abbreviated ways, in very concise ways, right? And so that's the beauty of the language. The language has always been beautiful in that way. English itself is a mutt. English, the endurance of English is that it has an aptitude to borrow from, linguistic traditions that are rhetorically impactful. And African American language, as in hip hop language, is very rhetorically impactful. And so people who demonize hip hop, exist inside of a mainstream that, embraces hip hop almost full-throatedly, linguistically, right?
Right.
But in terms of possibilities that the language creates for the young men, it gave them a vocabulary, it gave them, an expressive toolkit to begin to make sense of their reality.
Yeah.
The other finding from the study was that these young men use reading and writing as a way to tell their story.
Right. So the
As a
implication.
way to break the cycle of oppression. So if Steve Biko says the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, they use literacy in order to reclaim imagination, in some ways to reclaim their own mind space.
Okay.
That
So
real
what?
estate that's always been contested.
Right. We are coming to a close, believe it or not. As we close up, I'd like you to share one highlight, very poignant highlight from your study, and to also identify the implications of this for teaching black males, or teaching youth in urban settings.
All right, let me share one quickly. There's a poem that one of the young men wrote. Right, this young man sat in the back of the classroom. He didn't write the entire semester. The teacher says, "Professor Kirkland, what can I do to get these young men to write?" I tell her, I was like, they love hip hop, they love spoken word poetry. If you're gonna have them write stories, please don't have them write it in exposition. Let them first write it inside of a genre and a language that makes sense to them. And so she opens the assignment up. She allows them to write in a language that was appropriate to them. And this young man who sat in the back of the room who for the entire school year didn't write a thing wrote this. U-turn, left behind, legs falling on top of black back mountains, rivers that run deep like Sheba's queens, and she loves open pores inside empty cups that run over. hope like escalades, that faint darkness, that freezing night, that frickin' morning, uprising, light-skinned white men, blues is my brothers, black is my berry, sweet is my juice, so you turn back to me, I return back to you, I die daily for you. And I was like amazed. He wrote that, and when the teacher gave him his paper back, she told him that his use of certain words were incorrect or broken. She told him that certain spellings were lazy. In some ways, her imagination around his writing was broken. It wasn't him. And
Right.
so if I can leave teachers with one thing is that we have to move past the deficit theory
Okay.
that defines so many of our pedagogies. Instead of disengaged readers,
Okay.
how can we begin to ask, how are our classrooms disengaged to readers?
Okay, we have to stop there.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much for this interview. This conversation has to continue. I've been talking with David E. Kirkland, Dr. David E. Kirkland, the urban scholar, the author of A Search Past Silence, The Literacy of Young Black Men. Go out and get this book. This is a very, very important study. This reminds us of how we have to acknowledge and celebrate what our Black youth are doing. We have to take advantage and start where they are. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for your leadership, Dr. Kirkland. And this has been Brenda Greene, Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature. I want to thank my production engineer, Fritz Richardson. And I want to remind you, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers.
Next song was inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes. I'm sure most of you have heard of Langston Hughes. And he wrote a poem about rivers, and we call this song I've Known Rivers.